Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to the finale of our first season of the It's Not Scary, Just Music podcast. We're going to be wrapping up all of the 1980s today. I'm so excited for us to get going. And this is also just because I believe that the 1980s has really delivered us a lot of wonderful, intriguing moments that we've talked about over the course of this entire season from 1980 all the way up until 1989. We've experienced a lot of different genres coming into existence and dying and changing and morphing and mutating into these different shapes and forms, and it's been really wonderful to experience at this pace where when I was doing this listening project to begin with, I was just sliding through a lot of this stuff. So taking these moments to really dig into this music has been eye-opening to me, and I really hope that you've enjoyed going on this journey so far as much as I have. Before we really get going with the episode itself, I just want to start off by giving a shout out to everyone that's listening to this podcast. I think when I was starting to put together my confidence to do this podcast, I was expecting maybe one or two listeners a week for each episode. And the fact that we are talking about somewhere in the realm of 1,000 listens at this point across all platforms is definitely unexpected and fills my heart with such joy that all of you are enjoying this music and these experiences as much as I have. Because let me tell you, I'm getting a lot of DMs from people, getting a lot of conversations from people that are local to us that are listening that want to talk about everything that they're learning from the podcast, all the music that they are becoming aware of that they weren't before, or music that they've heard all their lives and never really sat down to appreciate in the ways that we're talking about it here, which is everything that I had hoped for from doing this podcast, that we are connecting people to this music, we're connecting to one another and creating thoughtful discussion as a community. That is the entire reason for why I did this podcast versus just continuing to listen to this music in my own personal project very privately. So it's very heartening to hear that people are taking away from this what I had hoped. So thank you all for all of the love and support that you've been giving us. I mean, we've got, hundreds of followers on social media in addition to that. And we've gotten the opportunity to interview artists that I never thought that we would get the chance to interview or talk to about their experiences. And these special episodes just keep coming. We didn't expect that any of that would be part of this podcast. And those opportunities have been presented to us. And we've really, really loved the chance to expand what we thought this could be into something even greater. And then to just conclude this section by just giving kudos to everybody that's been brave enough to challenge themselves to listen to different music than they've been exposed to previously, or music that they had judged themselves, or somebody had judged them for liking the music or engaging with the music that they wanted to engage with, and just approaching this fearlessly and saying, you know what? I don't know anything about alternative rock. I don't know anything about J-pop. I always judged people that listen to video game music. I never really cared about hair metal, but you're listening to all of these things and giving it a chance and letting your body just naturally and organically react to it, which is exactly what this is all about. It's about giving yourself the chance to ask yourself those hard questions of, how do I feel about this? How do I react to this? What does this mean to me, if anything? Because not all music has to mean everything to everybody, but you're at least giving yourself that chance to ask yourself that question. And we're going to keep asking ourselves these hard-hitting questions as we continue with this podcast into the next season and the next season and the next season. So let's keep challenging ourselves, shall we? Before we get into the music itself, just a reminder to check out the playlist that I've linked in the episode description today. As well, the big list for all of the 1980s, which is also in my episode description here. So my version of the essential playlist is essentially going to be all of the tracks that I'm going to call out today when we're talking through all of our music genres. And then my big list for all of the 1980s, folks, I did my best and got down to, I think, 142 songs that I considered to be the most important, significant, impactful, best, however you want to call it, of the entire decade. So if you have been hoping and waiting for a singular playlist of my opinions and perspectives on what are the most vital or critical songs for all of the 1980s. There's a big list. It's 142 songs, and it's linked in the description of this episode, so go enjoy it. So what are we talking about today? We're going to overview all of the major music genres from the 1980s that we've either experienced directly as part of these episodes, or that we've been sliding past and not talking about in great detail, but were impactful and meaningful in the 1980s. Ideally, if they started in the 1980s, talking a little bit about what might have created them, what makes them distinctive, and by 1989, what's going on with them. And then as we're talking about each of these music genres, talking about individual tracks from different artists in some cases that highlights where the genre started in the beginning of the 80s or at the beginning of its movement during the 80s, whenever it happened. And then as of 1989 or the end of that genre's movement, what did it sound like? So the first genre that we're going to talk about for the 1980s is avant-garde. You may recall that over the course of this season, I've been talking about how avant-garde pop and avant-garde rock have been evolving, shaping, weaving their way through the entirety of the decade. So let's talk a little bit more about what makes avant-garde distinctive. So avant-garde, typically, just by its name, tends to be more artistic and much more ambitious than other genres that it's modifying. So when we say avant-garde pop, it's highly ambitious, highly artistic pop music. So it's accessible music, but is on that highly experimentational bent that is so much so that it's not just experimental pop music. It's its own thing that is very distinctively from a high artistic experimentational place that could potentially influence that major genre that it's influencing, like pop or rock music. But on the whole, it's almost always considered to be the most artistic and cutting edge of any genre or subgenre or movement that's happening at the time. So the example that I'm calling out as one really early marker in the 80s is Daniel Johnston, Walking the Cow from the album Hi, How Are You? It came out in 1983. We called it out in the 1983 episode as an essential album for that year. So the reason that I call out Daniel Johnston's Walking the Cow is that it is extraordinarily experimentational. I think you could even go back to the 1983 episode and experience how I was talking about it at the time. But Daniel Johnston is using a lot of very intriguing tools in order to make the track come across like it was recorded very poorly. He was using a very cheap recorder in order to record the music, but you could really detect and understand and see how the music was coming across in a thoughtful way. And you know exactly he is doing all of this on purpose in order to create a highly distinctive sound, which is extraordinarily ambitious. You might remember listening to that track when we did the 1983 episode and thinking, wow, Daniel Johnston is really out there. He was. It's really great stuff. So Walking the Cow is, to me, a really great beginning example of where avant-garde was heading in that individual moment, which is highly ambitious, asking a lot of questions about what music even is, what does it mean, and how do we translate these ideas into pop music, rock music going forward. So, great early example. To me, a peak moment for avant-garde for the 80s was our next track, which is from 1985, Kate Bush, Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God, Hounds of Love. We didn't necessarily call it out in the 1985 episode. I think we actually mentioned a little bit about Kate Bush in our 1989 episode where we were talking about how Running Up That Hill is her gigantic, most impactful hit that is still resonating today because it's kind of returned to the zeitgeist. But in 1985, so a couple of years after Daniel Johnston came out with Walking the Cow, Hi, How Are You? She comes out with this track, which was such a peak for the avant-garde movement, where it's got a lot of really interesting instrumentation. Her vocal affectations are hyper interesting and gives rise to what was going to happen in the future of avant-garde pop and rock music and all the subgenres that are going to permeate in the 1990s and find a foothold. So this track, other than the fact that it's hyper famous, it's an amazing track that really highlights and spotlights her greatness as an avant-garde artist. And again, much like all these impactful, important milestones, is giving that roadmap to where other avant-garde artists can go in order to push the envelope of pop music, push the envelope of rock music, and all those things in between. So that one is a tremendous example that I'm so pleased to call out because we didn't get a chance to spotlight it in our 1985 episode. So that to me is like peak for 1980s avant-garde music. Is it sounds really 1980s. Kate Bush is killing it in this record. It's wonderfully produced. It's highly complex. It's really great stuff. And then finally, where I perceive the 80s avant-garde pop music trend is leaving the 80s and starting to think about its path into the 90s is in 1988, Birthday by the Sugar Cubes on their album Life's Too Good. We talked about this track in the 1988 episode. You might recall that this is Bjork. This is a band that Bjork was a part of before she became her own thing. And this track very effectively articulates who Bjork is, what her vision is, and how, in unfortunate and fortunate ways, how her genius and creativity was so completely overwhelming the rest of the Sugar Cubes band that it was inevitable that she was going to go and do her own thing. Just listening to this track, you can hear her genius. Her vocal affectations kind of talking about how Kate Bush affected her voice, how Daniel Johnston affected his voice, and just listening to where we are now in 1988 and how far, even in a 5-year period, the avant-garde concept has evolved. It's an amazing journey that happens in such a short period of time. And also it gives you a really good indication of where avant-garde is going to be going over the next several years, because come the early 90s, Bjork is going to become a thing by herself. And also avant-garde is not going to stop existing because it's going to keep evolving, shaping, challenging itself more aggressively than all other genres. So Birthday by the Sugar Cubes is just a great send-off to the 1980s in the avant-garde movement. So next, we're going to talk about dub and reggae. We've talked a little teeny tiny bit about dub and reggae over the course of the 80s. We've talked about Bob Marley for a little bit. We've talked about Yellow Man a fair bit. General Saint and Clint Eastwood. We haven't really talked about Mad Professor too much, but he's also been a huge influence in the dub and reggae scene. So there's been a lot that's going on in the dub and reggae scene that's been flying a little bit under the radar of our episodes, but you can find all that stuff in my big lists for most of these years. I've kept dub and reggae almost every single year. So unless you've been aggressively and intensively going through my big list and listening, you might have missed almost everything that was happening around dub and reggae. So let's get to it. So let's a little bit talk about dub and reggae. So as we may or may not know, dub and reggae, its origin point is in Jamaica. And when we say reggae, there's a lot that's baked into reggae because there's a lot of subgenres like toasting and dance hall that all are different nuances to reggae. And then for a lot of people, it may very well be that their only frame of reference to reggae is Bob Marley. And then dub is the other piece of reggae, where reggae is more the musicality, the instrumentation, the lyrics, the actual singing. Dub is more the bass component to it, or the rhythm section to reggae. And much like rap and DJing, by 1980 they had already split into their own distinctive things, where reggae utilizes dub and dub could utilize some reggae, but they are their own entities in their own right. So what we tried to do here for dub and reggae when we're talking about its trajectory is talk a little bit about how both concurrently evolved, since, as I said, much like with DJing, they do rely on each other and merge often. It's like a Venn diagram. So we're going to start with Bob Marley, because Bob Marley and the Wailers is a really great way to ground ourselves in the beginning of what was happening in reggae and dub in the 1980s. And we're actually going to end in 1985. Again, it's only a 5-year period, but things have shifted quite significantly. So in 1980, Bob Marley and the Wailers came out with their album Uprising, and the song that we're talking about is Could You Be Loved, which is one of his hugely famous hits. The reason that we're starting with this track is it really shows you how we were moving from the 1970s and even 1960s ideas of reggae, and how in 1980 it was still kind of sounding like those 70s, 60s reggae ideas, where it was fairly minimal. The rhythm sections weren't overt and in your face. Also, a lot of the music was finding that balance between being very R&B smooth in its own sense, but then also bringing that reggae rhythm to it that Bob Marley is necessarily known for. And Could You Be Loved is, as I said, one of his monster hits to really help ground you. Next, we talked about Yellow Man a couple different times during a variety of episodes, but Yellow Man at the time was considered to be the next big thing in reggae, and he inevitably was. But even at the very beginning, people understood his distinctive perspective and that he breathed new youthful life into the reggae movement where Bob Marley was starting to sundown. So in 1983, Yellow Man came out with one of his most popular albums, which is called Zunga 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 Zang, which even just in me saying that, you might actually be familiar with the track, Zunga 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 Zang, how I'm articulating the rhythm of the track title. But in 1983, he came out with this track, and it was very distinctly not like Could You Be Loved 3 years prior. It was young, it was fresh. There was a little bit of a rap edge to it, because Yellow Man is the dancehall king. He's also very good at toasting, so there's that rap component to it also. And it's definitely got a heavier dub rhythm section component than Could You Be Loved was. And so that was how the genre was evolving from 80 to 83. It was becoming younger, it was becoming a little bit faster, it was becoming a little bit more rap leaning. It was a little bit more of a party than it was just about everybody hanging out, smoking reefer, and talking about how the world was falling apart and we should combat that with love. You know, it was different. So that was what was happening in 83. And then obviously Yellow Man continued to be the king of reggae for years and years and years and years and years. Even to today, he's still unbelievably popular. But then in 1985, Mad Professor and Pato Banton came out with an album called Mad Professor Captures Pato Banton. The track, My Opinion, is a really fantastic way in order to show the trajectory of where we came from in 1980 with Could You Be Loved through Zunga 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 Zang with Yellow Man in 83. And then by 85, Pato Banton is basically stepping out there with essentially rap lyrics, and Mad Professor is a dub artiste, and so there was a lot of really excellent rhythm coming out of that. And so if you don't even take into account the Yellow Man track and you just listen to Could You Be Loved and My Opinion, they sound like a huge evolution between each other, again, in just a 5-year period. 5 years, that's nothing. That's no time at all. Just listening to how reggae, which as a genre, a lot of people that look at it from a distance or at a macro level might not necessarily understand or detect the nuanced evolution that it takes over any period of time. It was pretty significantly evolving and changing through half of the 80s. And so we're not even necessarily talking about how reggae continues to evolve aggressively into the 90s, into the 2000s, because dancehall starts to change a lot and become even more of its own thing. But at least during the 1980s, the way that they started to launch in those high, deep rhythms and into a more rap mindset, the pace and the speed of the music goes up, that we had to eject away from the slow, calm, cool, collected chill of Bob Marley in order to get to that moment. And these couple tracks that happen after that, you know, Zunga 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 Zang by Yellow Man and My Opinion by Pato Banton and Mad Professor, are great ways to just show how that distance is lengthening into what comes next. So next, let's talk about country music. I think that over the course of this season, we've been talking about country in a variety of ideas. I think that we use the term neo-traditionalist country a lot and use that to juxtapose to more traditional country, which is out on the frontier, old school country, versus what country enthusiasts would call more big hat country, country pop, or neo-traditionalist country. And over the course of the 80s, we talked about country a fair bit, and there's plenty more that we didn't even touch on, because there's a lot of music in my big lists over all of these years that has some form of country in them. There's also bluegrass in there, which we're not necessarily talking about too much, or string band music. But just for country, there's 3 tracks that I want to call out that really shows how country music in the pop variety has really tightened up and started to focus itself like a laser in order to turn into the genre that we all essentially know it to be even today. So starting off, let's talk about Angel of the Morning by Juice Newton on her album Juice, which came out in 1981. You can really tell that this track comes from the very early 80s. It actually kind of sounds like it probably should have come from the late 70s. It's got 70s Dolly Parton aspects, Dusty Springfield ideas. Like, it definitely sounds like something that could have come out in the 70s. It's still an amazing track. Juice Newton has an amazing voice. Angel of the Morning is a wildly famous song, and not just because it was used as a model for a very famous rap track in the future. It does help ground us in the very beginning of country music in the 80s. It's a really great example of not strict pop country, but just more country, and how it was fusing with those older 70s folk ideas into what this track becomes. Juice Newton really comes across as a country songstress from the 70s that just happens to still be doing this music in the early 80s. So it's a really great way to ground ourselves. Now, let's skip all the way to 1986 with Reba McEntire, Can't Stop Now, off of Whoever's in New England. So we talked about Reba McEntire in 84 when she did My Kind of Country, and the track that we called out specifically was How Blue. So that was 1984. Can't Stop Now, though, in 1986, sounds much more upbeat. It definitely sounds almost nothing like what Angel of the Morning in 1981 sounds like. It's faster paced. It's got a lot more youthful energy to it. It sounds more poppy, which is the greatness that is Reba McEntire. She could take country conceptions and infuse pop elements into it in order to create this new idea. And this is why Can't Stop Now is a really great example, because How Blue in 84 sounds more ballady, like Angel of the Morning in 81. But for 1986, Can't Stop Now, it's fast, it's punchy, it's got a really quick rhythm section to it, and so it comes across in a much more popish, more forward-leaning sort of way for where country music is going. And then finally, in 1989, Clint Black, Killin' Time, A Better Man. So, A Better Man, we talked about in the 1989 episode, in which this song, although he's not necessarily the first person to create this pop country music model of a song, it's a really, really salient example of using that model of structuring your country song in a very specific way that can be replicated over and over and over and over and over and over and over again for the next 4 decades. And it does, and it has. And so listening even to Can't Stop Now, which compared to A Better Man sounds far more traditional, even in its own right, because if you listen to Can't Stop Now compared to Angel of the Morning, Can't Stop Now sounds super poppy and Angel of the Morning sounds highly country. And then you compare A Better Man to Can't Stop Now, which is only 3 years later. Can't Stop Now sounds like traditional country to a T. So A Better Man is even more poppy. It's even closer to just being straight ahead pop music, which is amazing to see and listen to, because then you compare Angel of the Morning and A Better Man together and they sound like completely different genres. So A Better Man was definitely ushering in what we know to be the 90s sound of country music. In 89, this was just the model in which record producers were saying, wow, we need to find another Clint Black. I need a Clint Black. I need to find somebody that can do that. And they just started to accumulate all of these different country artists that were willing to follow this trend. And that's how we created the monster movement of pop country music in the 1990s. So it's a really great way to end the evolution of country music from 81 until 89. Okay, let's talk about electronica. So the first track that I'm calling out is by Haruomi Hosono, who was part of Yellow Magic Orchestra, on his album SFX that came out in 1984, and the track we're talking about is Body Snatchers. The reason that we're starting with Body Snatchers by Haruomi Hosono is it incorporates certainly all of the greatness and the genius that was Yellow Magic Orchestra, and thereby Kraftwerk and all of that industrial music that was coming out in the late 70s and very early 80s. And Haruomi Hosono is taking all of that and merging it with the turntablism that was starting to get really popular, really hot, using synths and keyboards in different ways than were used previously, and starting to create these distinctive electronica tracks that aren't necessarily committed to just synths and sounding more new wave, and it's not necessarily about him trying to sound like Kraftwerk. He's trying to make electronica be more distinctive and also album friendly, because the thing about artists in the electronica sphere, we're struggling to understand how do they create an LP off of the material that they're creating, because in a lot of cases they were either playing around in their studios trying to figure out how do I do this, or they were in the clubs, be it dance clubs or in just music clubs, doing live sets. And it was really hard to figure out how do we take this potentially highly organic experience and create something repeatable and structured so that I can make an LP out of it. In many ways, it was like creating classical orchestral symphonic music, where you had to really plan and plot out how do all these different sounds work with each other. And so Body Snatchers by Haruomi Hosono in 84, among the other tracks that we called out in the 84 episode of Alternative 3 and SFX The Track, Body Snatchers to me is the greatest example of how do we take these electronic synth ideas and position it and focus it in a way in which we're making it consumable for the masses in an LP style format. So it's a really great track to kick things off for us. Give it another couple years, 1986, and we're talking about Mantronix, Music Madness, the album, and then the track Big Band B-Boy. So we talked about this track in 1986. We talked about how it was that evolution past what Body Snatchers was doing in 84, in which we're taking even more turntablism, we're taking even more R&B conceptions and rhythms, and incorporating all these things together with synth ideas, and it's refining, it's becoming more of itself, versus we're taking a bunch of ideas and we're trying to put them together. Mantronix in 86 was putting it together into one cohesive concept that could be used as a launch pad and an instruction manual for other DJs and future electronic artists on where do they go from here in order to create that consumable package as an artist like any other artist. And then finally in 89, Meat Beat Manifesto, Storm the Studio, the album, God OD Part 1. We talked about this in 1989. The interesting thing about this track, not only in the fact that I definitely perceive it to be not only an end to the 80s electronica experience, but also a very clear sign of what was coming in the 90s, because it very much was, that it was basically doing the other side of what a lot of electronic artists were wrestling with in the moment, where Mantronix was doing track by track, very distinctive tracks, very distinctive perspectives in each one. Meat Beat Manifesto was going the other way, which was more that symphonic classical side where there were movements of the pieces. So God OD has 4 parts to it. This is just the very first part. It elicits manual goching from very early 80s, where it was essentially one continuous song that was split into different movements, but it was all one 45-minute idea. So Storm the Studio has 4 pieces to it, that each of the 4 has 4 movements to it. But if you just think about, again, the distance in the perspective from Body Snatchers to Big Band B-Boy, it's huge. And then from Big Band B-Boy to God OD Part 1, it's huge. It was a 2-year jump and then a 3-year jump. And if you listen to the difference between Body Snatchers and God OD Part 1, God OD Part 1 sounds like it has undeniable perspective. It makes it sound like Body Snatchers is still middling around trying to figure out what it wants to be. It's definitely contained in its own ideas, Body Snatchers, but God OD sounds very, very, very confident, and that the electronic artists by 1989 really know what they need to do in order to deliver on an album that is replayable, and it's not just this sort of organic experience that we happen to have recorded in a moment in time. Like, it's very specifically manufactured, and this is the sort of electronica that we can expect out of artists going into the 90s. So it's a really great way to close the book on electronica for the decade. Okay, so let's talk about folk music now. So where country music was pretty well defined by itself, and electronica music, I think we've talked about enough at this point where we're really starting to understand that it's essentially turntablism and DJing and synth music and all these electronic components put together. And depending on what the subgenre is, there may or may not be singing, but it's essentially highly crafted, highly curated electronic experiences and soundscapes. Folk, much like avant-garde, occasionally difficult to define. So folk in this case, especially the 80s version of folk, really involves a lot of singer-songwriting, and it's often quite acoustic. It's not a given that it's acoustic, but it's often acoustic. And the evolution at a macro level for what happened with folk music over the course of the 1980s is not inherently substantial, because folk has such deep traditions that launching out of folk even a little bit can make it come across as something else. So folk rock or pop music versus just being straight ahead folk. So folk usually has a very distinctive lane that it stays in out of sheer threat that it could accidentally verge into one of these other different territories. So when we talk about folk over the course of the 80s, it doesn't evolve a lot It just refines in these little tiny ways that has distinctive artists that come along that change the direction of the genre by tiny nuances. Because the reality is that the folk of the 60s doesn't really sound like the 70s too much. There are similarities, but between the 60s and 80s, it's pretty different. Between the 70s and 90s, it's different. The folk music of today, while still probably singing about the same kinds of things, social injustice, inequality, even day-to-day minutia challenges, like all of these things are frequent and common topics in folk music. The musicality and the voice affectations have changed over time, but for the most part, what they're singing about hasn't substantively changed, because that's kind of the nature of folk music. So we're going to start in 1984 with Christine Lavin, Future Fossils. The track is The Dakota. We did not call out The Dakota as a track in our 1984 episode when we called out Future Fossils as an essential album for that year. The reason that we're calling it out now is that where Cold Pizza for Breakfast or Don't Ever Call Your Sweetheart by His Name are very fun, entertaining tracks, which I find to be highly consumable, and it shows Christine Lavin's strength in creating highly relatable folk music that is very entertaining, possibly verging on pop music, but it's definitely still folk. Like, there's no question about it. Is that The Dakota is a much more straight ahead folk track on that album, and it is an amazing track. It really shows her strength as just a straight ahead folk artist and as a singer-songwriter, and it shows a good beginning for where the genre went over the next 5 years, because this is 1984 at this point. And Christine Lavin is an amazing songwriter. And like I said, The Dakota shows her strength, and it also shows how she could kind of veer into the hyper-traditional, old-school country ideas and merge that with folk, because those two things go hand in hand on occasion. And that was just a really great example of it. So let's move 3 years into the future, 1987, Suzanne Vega, Solitude Standing, Night Vision. Night Vision was a song that I called out in 87. I think I also used it when I was posting the wrap-up for the 1987 episode as the track that I used. I really like Night Vision, just letting you know my bias. But just listening to how The Dakota sounds and then listening to Night Vision in 87, totally different ideas. There's so much more instrumentation there. It's so much more haunting. It feels a little bit more avant-garde than Future Fossils was as an entire album. But Night Vision, to me, is one of the best, clearest examples of not just how folk music is evolving, because Tom's Diner on that album is also really great, and I would say is more traditional folk, and you can better line it up with The Dakota, but it's just her totally a cappella. Night Vision, though, is still basically just her singing, but there's a little bit of instrumentation, and you could listen to how Suzanne Vega was a little bit pushing the boundaries. She was just kind of pushing on them gently to say, what can folk be and what can it do as we're thinking about the future of folk music? So she was gently pushing on some of those conventions and some of those assumptions and boundaries when it came to folk for this track, which is why I call it out as kind of a peak moment of folk music for the 1980s, because the lyrics themselves are wonderful. She paints a wonderful, clear picture with her words. Like, her lyrics are second to none. I mean, they're so good. It really elicits in your mind what she's talking about. Even if it's just highly innocuous things, like Night Vision is really just singing about the idea of the lights being off and you being able to see in the dark. Like, it's a pretty straight ahead thing, and there's allegory and metaphor to it. And like I said, the minimal amount of instrumentation does push those boundaries a little bit on where can we go with folk beyond just being singer-songwriter. So that's why it's a peak. And then finally, in 1989, Indigo Girls, Closer to Fine on the album Indigo Girls. So the Indigo Girls, to me, is a great representation of at least early 90s folk music. It's the two of them with their guitars doing the singer-songwriter thing. Closer to Fine is, to me, just a really great example of how we were ending the 80s in folk music, but then also where are we going in the 90s? That sound that they're putting out with the affectations in their voices, how they're playing their instruments, what they're singing about, all of that stuff is very characteristic of the 90s. So it's just a really great way to close out the decade. And again, if you compare up The Dakota, leaving aside Night Vision for a second, but comparing up The Dakota by Christine Lavin, Closer to Fine by the Indigo Girls, they don't sound so far apart compared to some of these other genres that we've already talked about, but they're definitely different. They're not really the same. They're definitely folk, and it stays within that narrow lane of folk music. But one sounds like it's from the 80s / maybe even a little bit 70s-ish. And then Indigo Girls is leaning forward into what the 90s is going to sound like. So they do have their differences, and you can hear those little nuances if you really pay attention. All right. Next, we're going to talk about heavy metal. Actually, metal in all regards. Because metal has changed so many different times, at least 3 or 4 different times, over the course of the 1980s, that just calling it heavy metal, I think, doesn't do it justice. Unless you were going through that, or you're a huge audiophile that is really familiar with the 70s. A lot of people would assume that metal really started in the 80s, and the reality is that it started in the, I would even say 60s. In the late 60s, definitely very popular through the 70s, and then the 80s, it kind of hit a peak and really started to aggressively shift and change. But what we're seeing in at least the early 80s was just a runoff from what was happening in the late 70s. And then obviously it goes through several different iterations, which we're going to talk about as we discuss some of these tracks here. So, starting off, 1980, Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell, Neon Nights. This is a really excellent example of a couple different things. One is how Black Sabbath has aggressively changed since Ozzy Osbourne left the band, not too long in the past since this track came out. It highlights Ronnie James Dio, which had his own band, Dio. He had success in his own right, and so Ronnie James Dio was the lead singer of Black Sabbath in 1980 doing Neon Nights, and so it was merging the post-Ozzy Osbourne Black Sabbath band with Ronnie James Dio, putting it together into this highly consumable track that sounds essentially nothing like what Black Sabbath was doing before this and what Ozzy Osbourne was doing during and after this. So it's its own snapshot in time, which is really fun to start off these milestones with 1980 Black Sabbath Neon Nights. The track is really great by itself. I think in 1980 we didn't really talk about Black Sabbath or Heaven and Hell. So the reason that I called out Black Sabbath in 1980 is so that I could articulate what happens in 1981 with Lightning to the Nations by Diamond Head, which we talked about extensively in the 1981 episode. So I'm not going to necessarily bore you to tears talking about this over again in great detail. But the one thing that I will say, in case you missed it in the 1981 episode, is listen to Black Sabbath, Neon Nights in 1980, and then Am I Evil from 1981, Diamond Head. And they sound totally different from each other. I would even argue that Am I Evil sounds more 70s-ish, even more so than Black Sabbath does, but it's definitely leading forward on where metal music is going to be going into the future. So it's really interesting that somehow Diamond Head took what was, even before Neon Nights came out, which sounds a little bit more modern, and just careens over it and is just looking towards the future. It's really interesting stuff, which is why I call it out. And it's a really amazing track by itself. And that only happened 1 year later. But then following that, we start to get into more hair metal music. That starts to emerge. We get into death metal music, and all of its different permutations that came off of Diamond Head start to emerge. But the one track that I wanted to call out, as we're going through all of these different aggressive shifts and changes between Diamond Head and what I'm calling out here in 1986, Megadeth, Peace Sells, But Who's Buying is the album, and the track is Wake Up Dead. So we called out this track in 1986, and the reason that I'm highlighting it here while skipping over a lot of the micro shifts and changes that were happening post Am I Evil is that it brings together all of these different shifts and changes that happened up until that moment. So Venom coming out with black metal, Quiet Riot coming out with Metal Health, Metallica, Kill 'Em All, Rat Out of the Cellar, that was 84, Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil, that was 83. So all of this stuff that happened between Diamond Head and Megadeth, Wake Up Dead basically pulls all of these ideas together into one singular idea. Almost all of it happens over the course of one track. You even kind of hear a little bit of the Neon Nights thing going on there. You also a little bit hear some of the Am I Evil riffs going on there too. Like they pull it all together into this one thing. Because the thing about metal music is that despite the fact that it is so aggressively its own thing, it very much feeds on what was given to them in the past. Metal artists very much respect the past and honor it and put it on pedestals. And as a result, try to do what they can in order to not necessarily reference it, but just honor history. And so because of that, Megadeth Wake Up Dead in 86 is them honoring all the history that we just talked about here a second ago into one tremendous track. So that's why to me it's peak in 86. And then by 89, Nine Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine, Terrible Lie. We talked about it in 89. And the reason that we're talking about it here is, again, it pulls together everything that came after Megadeth. So Master of Puppets in 86 by Metallica, Slippery When Wet, also in 86 by Bon Jovi, Whitesnake, Guns N' Roses, Def Leppard. All that stuff feeds into what Nine Inch Nails is doing, which is to say that they're taking late stage hair metal that was starting to happen around 84 and has taken this really dark angle to it and turned it into this industrial metal idea that comes across in Terrible Lie. It a little bit sounds like Def Leppard. I think I even called that out in the 89 episode. It sounds a little bit like hair metal, but it's darker, it's deeper, it's more nefarious. It's really interesting stuff. And so those four moments that happen in metal, if you go back and listen to Neon Nights and Terrible Lie right next to each other, first of all, they sound nothing like each other, which is really, really great how far metal has come in 9 years. But just listening to how Neon Nights comparatively sounds like 70s music and Nine Inch Nails' Terrible Lie sounds like 90s music. But we know, as we've been going through this podcast, that there are these little major milestones that happen over the course of the decade that gives us those indicators of how things have shifted and changed. So this genre is a really great example of clear indicators on how bands were shifting and evolving, but honoring the past at the same time in order to arrive at these new moments that reached its conclusion in 89 with Terrible Lie. So going through the metal journey was super fun just because of how aggressively it changed, but it was so easy to hear all the different pieces be used from previous things into these new ideas. So that was a real joy for me, is experiencing those. And I got more on board with hair metal, which I think is a win for me because I wouldn't necessarily say it was scary, but I had a barrier. I had an assumption and a judgment that I was making, and I got past that and enjoy it very much so now. So I think that was at least a win for me as I was going through this experience. So next, we're going to talk about JPop. So you might remember from the very beginning of this season, we were doing a JPop check-in because we a little bit needed some training wheels around the JPop genre as listeners, but also the Japanese popular music genre needed a little bit of time in order to really up its game to get to the point that it got to. But it did eventually get there because we've called out over the course of the season many, many artists and albums that have been amazing. I think the major call outs, it started with Taika Oniki in 81. Henri was all over the place. Size was all over the place. So interestingly enough, we're going to talk about those three artists specifically as we discuss the milestones. But before we do that, just talking a little bit more about Japanese pop music to ground you, in case you haven't been listening to all of our episodes or haven't been paying attention to the JPop check-ins, is that Japanese popular music as a whole big umbrella genre encapsulates not just pop music, but also can incorporate certain degrees of rock music to it. It's like when we say things are pop rock, that they're very consumable rock music. There also can be some electronica components to it, but generally is under the major heading of J-pop. So in the very early 80s, we were mostly experiencing three different flavors. So there was the hyper avant-garde experimentational stuff, like think Yoko Ono. That's the kind of stuff that was happening in the 60s, 70s, and then was taking at least a couple different shapes in the 80s. They were heavily influenced by New Wave when we got to the 80s. So that's kind of how avant-garde and New Wave started to incorporate with one another. And noise, pop, and rock was also very prevalent at the time, but we didn't talk about it very much. But one could still kind of put it under the J-pop heading. And then city pop was the defining subgenre of J-pop at the time, that at once it sounds like music that could be played in an elevator or at a department store, and it's just inoffensive, unchallenging, and it sings about very banal topics like going to school or eating ice cream in the summertime. Like, it's really basic, happy stuff. But as time has gone on over the course of the 80s, the topics change a little bit. There's more upbeat tracks and upbeat artists that are infusing more R&B and disco into their ideas, and then the counterculture of rock starts to take off, and the avant-garde starts to focus more specifically on the counterculture of Japan and pushing back against the Japanese idol conception and popular culture and people's reactions to Certainly the idols, but also kind of women culture in Japan as a whole. So there's a lot of cultural turmoil that's happening in Japan all throughout the 80s that helps to get us from one end to the other. So what I'm going to call out first is Taiko Unuki, A Venture, and the track is called Chansu, or Chance, from 1981. So we called this out in the 1981 episode. It was actually the first J-pop album that made it onto our essentials. And the reason that we called it out there, and we're going to talk about it here, is that Taiko Unuki and her producers were creating soundscapes a little bit more ambitious and a little bit more interesting than some of the other artists that were coming out at the time, which sounded more 70s songstress ballads. And there wasn't a lot of instruments other than just propping up the fairly simplistic lyrics that were being sung about, and also the intonation of the singing was just in rhythm with the music, and it was just very structured and very cookie cutter. Taiko Unuki was challenging that a little bit in 81 by exploring different ideas that were perhaps getting absorbed from bands like Plastics, which was more new wave, and taking some of those synths and incorporating those into the music so that it sounded a little bit more interesting, a little bit more forward-leaning than what we were experiencing with other artists at the time, like Seiko Matsuda, which is considered to be one of the greatest J-pop artists that has ever been. She was definitely like the big ultra popular Japanese pop idol at the time. So around her, there were other artists that were doing, I would say, more challenging, interesting things than she was, and she was more just the tentpole of all of Japanese popular music at the time. But as you all probably know from going through these episodes, I had a huge affinity for Henri because her music was a little bit more focused on dance and disco conventions and R&B conventions, and also she's a really great singer. So because of that, we were really calling out Henri albums pretty consistently in the early 80s, especially because of how forward-leaning she was, as if all the other J-pop artists were in this sleepy daze where they were just singing about, like I said, fairly banal things, and Henri was trying to wake people up with the music. So that's why the next track that we're going to call out is from 1984, Henri Cool with 3 O's, and the song is going to be Kimamani Reflection, the new version, as if there were an old version, and I don't really think there is. But Kimamani Reflection, first of all, is incredibly different than Taiko Unuki's Chansu. There's a lot more disco, there's a lot more dance, pop, there's a lot more R&B that's infused into it. I would say that despite the fact that she actually had a couple albums that came out before this in 83, Bikini and Timely, we called out Timely in our 83 episode with Cat's Eye and Windy Summer and things like that, that Kimamani Reflection in 1984 just leapt so far out beyond what was going on in city pop for the prior few years that it's super dancey. Like the horn section is very classic J-pop, especially for the 80s, and it's all over this track. It just really, really sounds like if somebody were to ask me what 80s J-pop sounds like, I'd probably exactly play this track without question, because it sounds so quintessentially 1980s J-pop. All of it just kind of comes together into this beautiful package, and that's why I would call it like the first peak of J-pop in the 80s. So next, from 1986, Size, the album is Picnic, and the track is Woman's. So much like Size is PSY-S, this track is Woman-S, so Woman's. We didn't talk about Picnic in 1986, but it is a hugely important, impactful track. So we talked about in 1985, Size's first album, Different View, and there's a few tracks that I called out from there to really start to show that Size was trying to take J-pop in a different direction that was much more synth-based. There was rock components to it, but it's very distinctly still J-pop. The lead singer still comes across as a J-pop idol. It's just all of the instrumentation, so the partner that she has that's doing all the instrumentation, he has a very clear vision on how to push the envelope around J-pop, and it comes across very distinctly in Woman's. It's a little bit more challenging than what we listened to with Chansu. Chansu sounds a little bit department store music, where you don't really have to pay attention to it that hard. It's just kind of generally talking about good times and love and relationships, and you don't really have to pay attention to it that hard. Woman's really elicits your attention and really encourages you to focus on it, just because the instrumentation is fantastic. It's very punchy. It's very distinctive. I can't really think of other songs that sound like this, especially from the 80s. And you can believe me on that, because I've listened to thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of songs from the 80s at this point, right? I think we all kind of know that about me. But when I heard this song for the first time, it just sounded totally different from all J-pop that I'd heard before it and after it. And it didn't really sound like anything else that anybody else was doing in the world. And so because of that, I thought, wow, Size is really trying to make whatever's coming out of Japan both sound distinctive and that it can really contend with what else is going on in the rest of the world. And it's tracks like this that really put that forward. Like I said, though, it's still poppy, but does it sound anything like Chansu? No. Does it sound like Kimamani Reflection? Maybe a little bit, but it's got its own thing going on. And then finally, in 1989, Size again changes it up completely with their album Atlas, and the track is Wandering Up and Down. This is a really great way to end J-pop in the 80s, because I think in 1988, I called out the album Nonfiction by Size and the track specifically Parachute Limit, where I said that Parachute Limit essentially was putting a knife in the back of historical J-pop and we were going in completely different directions, which is definitely true. But Wandering Up and Down in 1989 on their album Atlas further takes those ideas that they've been playing with over the last several years, even with Woman's all the way up until this moment. And this sound that's coming up and Wandering Up and Down sounds like J-pop from the 90s. It's definitely forward-leaning, it's hyper-melodic, but it's really engaging. Not melodic like Chansu was, and it definitely sounds nothing like disco from Kimi Money Reflection. It sounds like its own thing, and all of the instrumentation that's happening is very 90s sounding for J-pop. Like when we get into season 2 and start talking about J-pop in the 1990s, you'll start to listen to what I mean, but believe me when I say that this track sounds like where we're headed with J-pop. And I think that Size, although we're starting to get towards the end of their run in 89, that they were clearly still thinking about what is the future of J-pop going to be and how can we be bastions of that? And they're executing it spectacularly with this track. So it's a really excellent way to close down and bookend J-pop from the 80s. And I, again, would challenge you to listen to Chansu from Taiko Unuki in 81 and Wandering Up and Down by Size in 89. Nothing alike. They sound completely different. You might even say Wandering Up and Down isn't even J-pop because those two things don't even sound remotely the same. They are all J-pop. Like I said, it's a gigantic umbrella, and the Japanese really continue to challenge themselves on what this brand means. And Size was out there figuring it out with gusto. So next, let's talk about New Wave. So I think that we all kind of know and understand that New Wave is best defined in the 80s, but I'd like to believe that as we've been going on this journey and exploring through these years and these episodes in the podcast, that New Wave, first of all, had origins previous to it being considered New Wave, but then also the sort of vapor and the ether of New Wave continues to weave its way through later genres that might have callbacks to New Wave, but for the most part, New Wave is eventually left behind as an idea in favor of what comes next in the 90s, but it never fully goes away. Because I think that the synth components and the haunting, disconnected, disembodied vocals, those ideas never necessarily go away altogether. I think that New Wave just eventually kind of breaks into pieces and other artists start to figure out how to take all those pieces and do what they want with it to turn it into new things. So when we talk about New Wave, within the context of the 1980s, we can really just talk about where it started and where it eventually ended up, that it bridged into whatever the future took. So the first track that I want to call out is in 1980, The Buggles, The Age of Plastic was the album, and the track was The Plastic Age. We talked about this in the 1980 episode. I think we also talked about how Video Killed the Radio Star was also on this album, but The Plastic Age, to me, is the greatest example of whatever was going on, which I don't know about, in the late 70s from a new wave perspective. In 1980, it was a really great way to say, okay, if we're officially not remembering what happened in the 70s and we're just starting with 1980 and drawing a line in the sand there, The Plastic Age by The Buggles in 1980 is a great way to just start this whole thing off because it sounds quintessentially like early new wave, very much so. I think when we all think of new wave, we probably think of something that sounds approximately like this. And it's got the synths, it's got the disembodied voices, it sounds a little bit robotic. It's talking about the age of not just actual plastic, but how everybody is becoming plastic, which is a very new wave 80s missive that existed in the counterculture at the time. It's very characteristic of new wave in the 1980s, especially in the early times. So starting with that, I think it articulates what new wave is, which was rejecting, essentially, what was happening in the 70s with album rock and arena rock and the singer-songwriter folk pop things, all those things that were happening in the 70s, Southern roots rock, everything that was happening in the 70s that wanted to be walked away from in favor of synths and more mechanical sounds or more artificial sounds, just all of those ideas really articulates kind of new wave to a T. So the Buggles' Plastic Age in 1980 perfectly embodies that. So it's a really great place to start. Next is Falling by Blue Peter on the album Falling, which came out in 1983. The interesting thing about this track is unless you knew that this was Blue Peter, you probably would assume that this is 3, 4, or 5 artists that it isn't before you actually put your phone up to the thing and say, what is this track? And it's Blue Peter Falling, and you go, what? I've never even heard of that. Unless you have heard of that because you're a big audiophile from the 80s or you grew up in the 80s and you know who Blue Peter is. But listening to this track Falling by Blue Peter, first of all, sounds like late stage, early new wave, for sure. It sounds like a lot of what was going on around the new wave space in the early 80s. So if we're talking about Ultravox, we're talking about Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, Human League, you could even put Duran Duran in there, even though that was a little bit later, New Order, Howard Jones, like there's a lot of different artists that you might think that this is, which is just a really great articulation of how all-encompassing Falling as a track is, because it just hits all of those markers from so many different artists at the same time that happened before, that happened after. So in one or more ways, it was influential, or at the very least, again, great milestone of the moment, because you couldn't even hardly tell who it is if you weren't thinking that hard or if you weren't familiar. Then a couple of years later, 1985, Tears for Fears' Everybody Wants to Rule the World by Songs from the Big Chair. I called this out in 1985. It's one of my favorite tracks ever, but also from the 80s. There's some sort of deep emotional connection that I have to this track that I don't entirely understand. Like I hear that opening riff and something in my body happens and I'm not totally sure what the connection back to my childhood is. But this track, I think I'd even said in 85 that this was a really wonderful send-off to that early era of new wave music, because it had become highly consumable, its perspective was undeniable, it had really softened out all of the different artifacts that were happening, like in the Plastic Age by the Buggles, where it was very mechanical, disembodied voices singing in a very robotic sort of way to elicit that experience, and also the heavy synths. Just it made you feel like you were living in a circuit board. And this sounds like rock music, it sounds like pop music. It's still got the synths. It even still has that kind of hopeless perspective that most new wave tends to have about the world. I mean, the track itself is titled Everybody Wants to Rule the World, right? They embody all of those things. They embody all the history of new wave, and yet it sounds nothing like the Plastic Age because it's just evolved as a sound so much over time. Everybody Wants to Rule the World is just such a great pinnacle for new wave, in my opinion, because it brings together all of these wonderful things in this highly consumable package. It's just amazing stuff. And then finally, in 1987, What Have I Done to Deserve This by Pet Shop Boys and Dusty Springfield on their album Actually. The reason that I call this out as essentially the end of the hard-coded definition of new wave is that after this, new wave has already been splintering off over the prior several years into their own distinctive things. Like XTC, who had already been going for a long time, sounds nothing like Pet Shop Boys. That sounds nothing like Crowded House. That sounds nothing like Tears for Fears, Aha, Talking Heads. All of them are doing different things, very different things. But it's all still under this banner of new wave. And so as these different subgenres have defined their little territories and moved away from each other, something like What Have I Done to Deserve This by Pet Shop Boys just shows that although there are definitely still aspects of Everybody Wants to Rule the World or Falling or even the Plastic Age a teeny tiny little bit, this sounds like electronica. But also it sounds like pop, but also it's definitely new wave. So it's pulling all of these great things together in a way that shows that clearly new wave at this moment in time was having an identity crisis, but they were still making it work because there were still foundational things to tap into, like the electronic or synth component, or the mechanical or disembodied voices are still a little bit here with what Pet Shop Boys are doing with their voices. All these things still kind of exist. It's just taken such complex different shapes that you could tell that comparing this up to Plastic Age, like listen to them together, in this 7-year period. It's both refined up and also created so many distinctive personalities within it that it's really hard to best define it, which is really amazing that so many artists have found so many definitive footholds in the genre that they can either create these highly complex tracks like this or just branch off into their own things, like going in the totally electronica route or going in the totally pop route with Crowded House, Don't Dream It's Over, or Don't You Forget About Me, or The Cure. Cure started off in 1979, and up until this moment, it's still technically new wave. It's got a little bit of that emo thing to it, but it's definitely still kind of in that new wave genre and realm. By the time you get to 87 with What Have I Done to Deserve This, you might even not even process that we're still talking about new wave at this point because it's just evolved into something else entirely. So that's why among all of these genres, with new wave, you have to pay the closest attention because the evolution is so aggressive that you really have to listen hard for how does Plastic Age and What Have I Done to Deserve This link to each other. They sound pretty similar, but you really have to think, like, where is that trend line? Because new wave was just chock full of innovation every day, every year, every artist, every album. It was amazing. Okay. Let's talk about pop. I think when we talk about pop generically, there's a lot of different ideas going around when we talk about pop music, because when we say pop, it's just ultra consumable music, but how the artist is executing pop can vary widely. For example, Phil Collins and Hall & Oates don't sound the same. The Bongos and Huey Lewis and the News don't sound the same. Marine Girls / Tracy Thorn doesn't sound like Madonna, but it's all pop music, right? So it can be very challenging sometimes to best define what pop is other than just being highly consumable music. And so because of that, when we're talking about the evolution of what was highly consumable or what was on the radio the most during this era, that's all we can really do in order to create a bounding box for ourselves when we're talking about pop music. And as we're going into the 80s, there was a lot of different ways to define pop music. And with this first track, we're going to have to explain it a little bit. So 1981, Hall & Oates, Privatize the album, Privatize the track. This is Blue-Eyed Soul, but it's definitely pop music because it was all over the radio and everybody was playing it and listening to it. So everybody's pretty familiar with Privatize as a track. And if you aren't, then go listen to it because it's a really great track and Hall & Oates are amazing. But this has synth components to it for sure. It's also a little bit calling back to the roots rock and roots ideas that were happening in the 70s. This is just a little bit different. The Blue-Eyed Soul thing carries those 70s ideas forward from disco, from that era of R&B into this new moment. And so Privatize / Hall & Oates is carrying that forward by establishing in 81, we're merging R&B and roots ideas together with pop into this new package, and you get Privatize. So it's a really great way to start off the genre for the decade. And then another couple years later, we get Lucky Star by Madonna, 83. So Lucky Star sounds, I would say, not even close to what Privatize sounds. They're both very consumable. They both have pop hooks for sure. But what Hall & Oates and Madonna are doing are different zip codes from each other. Totally different. Different countries, different continents. It's different stuff. But that's what makes Hall & Oates great and Madonna great is they can both create hooks in a vacuum. And they both work, even if they sound nothing like each other. This isn't like metal where there's very defined rules in history. With pop, there are no rules. It's just, can you find something that has a pop hook to it that gets people to pay money and listen to the radio and go to concerts and this and that? Like, that's all that matters. And so the fact that we go from Privatize to Lucky Star, the first thing I'll talk about as far as connection points is the synths. So there's synths much more so in Lucky Star than there is in Privatize. Privatize sounds like it's more just tapping into what was in the 70s, and it just sounds a little bit more modern with a little bit of synths. Lucky Star sounds very synth heavy. Even in the first 10 seconds, it's nothing but synths. It's something that I don't think would have flown in 81, where it's just so synth forward and Madonna's voice is so distinctly not 70s sounding that it just sounds like its own thing. It sounds like we're leaping into the 80s with modern, young, fresh ideas and sounds. And Lucky Star just perfectly articulates that because it's very consumable. It is very synth heavy. And obviously Madonna's a super pop star. It's a really good articulation to move things along in the 80s. And then in 86, Steve Winwood, Higher Love on the album Back in the High Life. So that's 1986. You can better hear connection points between Lucky Star and Higher Love. The snare drums are a little bit punchier. We're starting to better flow with the synths, where I think in Lucky Star, the synths are very palpable and they're very apparent in the track itself. So much so that this sounds like a synth pop dance song, where in Higher Love, it's better weaving through the rest of the song. So it's adding to the song, but it's not necessarily the point of the instrumentation of the song. So it's clear that by 86, pop artists have figured out how to better weave synths into the rest of their music vision so that it all comes together in a more cohesive package rather than just, we're spotlighting synths because synths are the hot thing right now. I think by 86, they were less of the hot thing and they were more just a great addition to what else was going on. Also, I want to call out that in this track, it's a combination of Steve Winwood and Chaka Khan together doing this track, which interestingly enough, I find to be a little bit of a call back from the 70s where there were a little bit more man-woman duos that were doing more pop music. And this is more just a lean forward on that in the 80s version, which I think is probably why it works, that it was taking 80s conventions, taking 70s ideas, and it was creating a highly consumable product that perhaps multiple generations of people could appreciate at once. And so that's why it was a little bit less polarizing than Lucky Star and Madonna as a whole, which she's sort of expecting that young people are going to be pursuing her music. And she was right. Whereas Higher Love was taking all those ideas that was happening in Lucky Star and making it more consumable for an even wider audience than before. And the inclusion of Chaka Khan adds that very slight hint of R&B to it, which I think is also super helpful. And Steve Winwood has a little bit of that blue-eyed soul thing going on from what happened with Hall & Oates in 81. So again, we're putting a lot of those different pieces together into one more highly consumable, complex package that works for a wider audience. And then finally, in 1989, 3 years later, Madonna, Like a Prayer, and the track is Express Yourself. We already had Madonna, kind of like Size with JPop, comes in, comes out, and changes things up and leaps back out there as another milestone. So Express Yourself, unlike Like a Prayer, the track, is much more dance pop. It's incorporating a lot of the sort of R&B ideas that have been getting played with on the R&B side for the last 6 or 7 or 8 years. Madonna's changed up her voice a little bit since Lucky Star, where she was just kind of coming across as a new artist that was really scrappy and trying to make a name for herself. And with Express Yourself, Madonna has already clearly commanded an audience. She's commanding a following, and she's sending a message out to all of her fans and all of her listeners. In this case, it's about eliminating toxic masculinity, which is why that Madonna, in this case, in 89, is a great bookend, because we went from Private Eyes in 1981 to Express Yourself, where Private Eyes was, a little bit more of a quiet, contemplative, introverted song, and Express Yourself is about getting yourself out there and being yourself. And I wouldn't say that Private Eyes was necessarily encouraging one to be one's true self, one's whole entire self. And so the fact that those are the beginning and the end of the era also really shows where pop culture, not just pop music, but pop culture had evolved over the course of the 80s, which was to step out and be yourself and to pursue and have higher expectations for the connections that we have with each other, which is really great stuff because I don't really perceive that that was necessarily happening as much in the 70s or in the 60s. So this challenge, this call to action of we should be better and more meaningfully and more genuinely connecting with each other is a really interesting way to sort of end the decade, especially because as we get into the 90s, who knows what's going to come after this? I mean, I think some of us kind of know where it goes, but it's exciting nonetheless to see how the message in pop culture has changed so aggressively from 81 up until this moment, because it just creates a bright future for what's to come in the 90s in pop music for sure. Okay, so now that we've talked about how did pop culture evolve over the 80s, let's talk about how counterculture evolved, which is punk music. When we talk about punk music, obviously punk has already been around for quite a long time by the time 1980 hits, to a degree that The Clash has already firmly established the evolution away from high counterculture to it becoming maybe a little bit pop culture. So it's not like when we're starting 1980, we're starting from it being hyper traditional still, because it isn't. It definitely isn't. By 1980, there's already been a lot of question marks around what punk is, what it could be. The traditionalists separating themselves from perhaps the more avant-garde, separating themselves from the more pop punk artists. So there's already quite a bit of variety when we get to 1980 with punk music. But having said that, we're going to start with 1981, The Replacements, Sorry Ma, Forgot to Take Out the Trash, I Hate Music. So, Sorry Ma, I Forgot to Take Out the Trash was a conspicuous absence from 1981, though I Hate Music is an amazing track. It elicits in me feelings that I experienced when I listened to Land Shark, which is, short to come here, in 1982. So, I Hate Music to me is perfect punk music. They play the music very fast, which is quintessential punk. It's a very short track. They're talking about things that they don't like. It's a very funny track. They are playing like they don't really care very much, which again, perfect punk. And then one of the fun things about it too is that it more deeply connects with young people, like teenagers, where I think punk music has always, as a counterculture, tapped into teenagers, late 20s people, and maybe even younger people than that. But for some reason, this track comes across to a much younger audience. Like it seems highly accessible to even people in middle school that are 12, 13, maybe 11. It's a highly accessible song that is still so completely punk in every feasible way that it's just a really great way to start off our conversation around what's happening with punk in 81. It certainly had the anger and the vitriol and the frustration from the 70s and the late 60s. And it even a little bit sounds like the later iteration of punk that gets super popular in the 1990s. This sounds like that, except it's 1981. So it's a really great place to start. Next, we're going to skip over Dead Kennedys. We're actually going to skip over Fang because I think we've talked about that a fair bit already. And also Fang is a little bit more of a long game, right? Because I don't think the Fang sounds or Dead Kennedys really starts to take off in honoring those punk sounds until a long time from now. So we're going to skip over that. And we're going to talk about Social Distortion, Mommy's Little Monster, Moral Threat from 1983. And the reason that we're going to talk about this track is the consumability of punk has ratcheted up considerably with this track because there's slow aspects to it. It's actually a long song. I think it's 5+ minutes. It's got rock elements to it. So not just punk music, but it's got like rock and roll elements to it, which over the course of some of the episodes we've talked about, especially around punk music, it starts to get incorporated into punk and create a more consumable package when you slow it down a little bit. The instrumentation with the guitars starts to lengthen out a little bit. So it's not just we're playing it as fast as possible. You can actually hear a lot of the notes that we're putting out there. So Moral Threat definitely is still singing about and talking about all of the things that punk always talks about. Everything around counterculture, the injustice of the world, how the government is pushing you down. I mean, the track is called Moral Threat. So it's definitely still a commentary on society. But the instrumentation is the hero here. It's a really excellent song. You might even elicit ideas of 70s roots rock music or progressive rock music where some of these riffs will go on and on and on. They're all really great, but they do go on and on versus traditional punk music that's like a minute and a half. There isn't any time for you to get into a guitar riff, but this one definitely does, and it's very good. And what you could think about in this moment too is what was Diamond Head doing just a year or two prior? It sounds like it's in that rock metal vein. And so Social Distortion in this case is fusing a lot of different rock and roll and metal elements into this track. And it's at the end of the album, so you might not think about it too hard, even though it is one of their very popular tracks that they ever came out with. But it's at the end of the album, so I don't necessarily think it was an afterthought for them, but it's a vitally important milestone in the history of punk music in the 80s, just because of how much the sound is softened, despite the fact that it still sounds like punk. It's a really great track. And then finally, we're going to skip through Crass, which was that year, Squirrel Bait we talked about, there was more Social Distortion, and then eventually in 1989, we're going to arrive at Bad Religion. So the reason that we went from 1983 until 89 is post 1983-ish, punk music really kind of evaporated. It was there and it was happening, and then the quality punk music just sort of disappeared. For the most part. Like there's one album here and there that pops up, but for the most part, the idea just waned and blew into the wind, and that was it. And people weren't really engaging with it very meaningfully, with the exception of 2, 3, 4, 5 critical bands that were coming out with great stuff. But for the most part, the movement or the scene had really quieted down considerably. But in 1989, with Bad Religion coming out with No Control, the album, it seemed to breathe new life into punk and where it could potentially go. And the reason for that is, much like with Moral Threat, it became much more melodic. The message, you could better understand what they're talking about in some of these cases. I mean, at least with Bad Religion with No Control, the album, some of it's a little bit vague, but for the most part, you could exactly hear what the singer is saying the whole time, which I think is not necessarily a given from historic punk music. But the track that I'm calling out specifically, Billy, it has a story to it. It's a very distinctive story. The instrumentation sounds more like Moral Threat than it does I Hate Music. It's fast, right? So it's definitely still punk music, and it kind of subverts what Moral Threat did and goes back to it being about a minute and a half. But it's giving a roadmap and invigorating new life into the genre for 90s punk bands to see that punk can live again. It can take this slightly different shape and it can live again. And so that's why Bad Religion, No Control in 1989 is just a great way to end the punk era of the 80s. And Billy specifically, because it's one of the most poignant tracks on the whole album. Almost all the tracks are great, but Billy's one of the best ones. It's definitely one of the most thoughtful ones, that's for sure. And it creates that really great bookend to a hyper-aggressively changing, self-challenging, and self-selecting genre as the punk scene has been and was, like the purity tests and the question marks about what it is or what it isn't, and where it could go and what we're allowed to infuse into it and not, and what are all the rules for something that should have no rules. There was a lot of turmoil that happened in the 80s around punk music, and the fact that where it ended was something that was highly consumable for the masses after all of this jostling and collisions is a really interesting conclusion. Okay, let's talk about R&B. So if you've been listening to the podcast this whole time, you know that there's been several major waves of R&B that have taken place over the course of the 1980s. It started with essentially taking what was from disco and punching it up a little bit, making it a little bit faster, and not necessarily something that you have to dance to or that you're encouraged to dance to because the rhythms are different. So it's not as danceable as it has been. And then at the same time, pursuing something that is more poppy than I would say it ever has been before. I perceive that at least in the 80s, there was a huge push to make R&B become either the standard sound for pop music in Western society or so big that it might as well be. And I think that it's debatable which direction it ended up landing in, but there were several artists that came out in the 80s that did firmly establish the R&B genre as either the standard or some kind of standard for pop music going forward, because these days in the 2020s, there are R&B elements in almost all pop music, regardless of who's singing it, regardless of what country it is or what language they're speaking. There are R&B elements that are infused into all of it. So clearly where that started, be it in the 1980s or directly before it with disco, the major leaps that took place in R&B during this decade ushered in the next 40 years of pop music and obviously R&B from a pure sense. So starting off in 1980, the Jacksons, the album is Triumph, and the track is This Place Hotel. Or Heartbreak Hotel, either way. We talked about this track in the 1982 episode when we talked about Thriller for about 5 seconds, because where people perceive that Thriller happened in this tremendous vacuum of inspiration, no. This Place Hotel came out 2 years beforehand on the album Triumph, and it is essentially the lead up to Thriller. The ideas are there, the musicality's there, it's all there. I think we just kind of needed to take Quincy Jones and turn it into what Thriller became, but This Place Hotel was the beginning of that. It sounds minimally like disco. There's obviously still like the horn components, the beat components. There's definitely aspects of that where you go, yeah, I could kind of hear how this is disco if you're not intending to dance to it. It's very much out there for the Jacksons. If you know anything about the Jacksons, the Jackson 5, or Michael Jackson when he was much younger in his career, what kind of music they were putting out. This is different, very, very different. And it's highly ambitious, and it does make you question what R&B music is if it's not disco or anything that is around disco or Motown or anything else in the golden era of R&B. Then what is it? And the answer is this. It's a really great way to just ground ourselves on what's going on at the very beginning of the 80s with R&B music, because everything that comes after this is both hard right turns, shocking to a certain degree, and also, like I said, the waves that happen that are so distinctive from one another are so palpable every single time. So every time we jump to one of these successive tracks here talking about the milestones, it's just going to feel like a hard right turn every time, because R&B just changed so aggressively over the course of the decade. So what do I mean by that? Well, in 1982, Michael Jackson did come out with Thriller, and that was only 2 years later. And while This Place Hotel does sound very similar to Thriller, Thriller in no way sounds like disco. It sounds completely different from disco. It's its own thing. Whereas This Place Hotel had 15% disco elements, Thriller in no way sounds like disco. They might as well be different things. This is also to say, too, yeah, we could talk about the music video and everything else that came along with it, and Thriller as an album. But Thriller, the track as an idea, was just such a fully realized version of This Place Hotel. And at the same time, was so distinctly different than straight ahead Motown or disco, or even what Rick James was doing with Street Songs in 1981, or what Luther Vandross was doing in 1981 also with Never Too Much, or what Prince was doing with 1999 at the time, that it's so pop, and it definitely catapulted Michael Jackson to the greatest of great heights and being the king of pop as he was. But Thriller was just such an amazing milestone for R&B music because it's so aggressively challenged in that moment what R&B was, and could it become the sound of pop? And the answer was yes, because it did. And over time, it just, as we go along here, that connection softens and strengthens and softens. So it's just kind of this back and forth relationship between how R&B pop actually is over the next 40 years or so. So just 2 years later, in 1984, Chaka Khan comes out with I Feel For You, which is a cover of a Prince song from, I think, 79, because in 79, Prince came out with Prince and I Feel For You. The original was in 1979, and then he helped rearrange it for Chaka Khan in 84. There's rap components, which didn't happen so much in Thriller. You know, obviously Vincent Price was talking, but that wasn't rapping. It was poetry to a certain extent, but definitely not rapping. There's way more synths in this than in Thriller, and that's to say too that Thriller had a lot of synths in it, especially compared to This Place Hotel, which This Place Hotel's instrumentation was much more traditional rhythm and blues instruments, where Thriller was not for the most part. And I Feel For You had even less of that. It was even more synths than that. I would say it's like 95% synths. Also, the beat of it, you could hear some beat elements in I Feel For You from Thriller. So there is a connection point there. It's not like R&B was continuously dropping everything that happened in the past and replacing it with something new. But I Feel For You does leap out even further than Thriller did 2 years prior. And it does make Thriller sound a little bit antiquated comparatively, because I Feel For You just feels even more forward-leaning than that, even more poppy, even more general for the pop culture audience. And then 2 years later with that, Janet Jackson came out with the album Control, and What Have You Done For Me Lately? What Have You Done For Me Lately feels even more poppy than I Feel For You, which feels incredibly more poppy than Thriller was, and so on and so forth. So just these hop, skips, and jumps from This Place Hotel to Thriller to I Feel For You to What Have You Done For Me Lately, all of this has happened in 6 years. 6 actual entire years. That's it. It's almost no time at all. And we've already gone from This Place Hotel to What Have You Done For Me Lately? What Have You Done For Me Lately seems to, as I said, the kind of wax and wane of how much R&B incorporates pop elements to it. It's definitely poppy, but it's got a little bit more of an R&B rhythm and blues edge to it than I Feel For You did, which was, I would say, far more synth pop. This is definitely synth, but it's got more R&B elements to it. The bass line is much more R&B-esque. Her intonation is a lot more R&B-esque. So it's definitely going back to those R&B conventions, but is still leaning into the future for sure. Because as we know from anybody that was around and listening to pop music in the 80s, What Have You Done For Me Lately was a very distinctive sound that clearly ushered in a lot that came after it. And then we're going right to Janet Jackson again 3 years later in 1989 with Rhythm Nation 1814, Miss You Much. So Miss You Much to me is a great way to end this decade for R&B, because somehow Janet Jackson between 86 and 89 figured out how to completely and utterly not only evolve her sound, but in turn was pushing everybody else in R&B to challenge their conceptions. Like Michael Jackson had annihilated with Thriller, and then Control came out, and then Michael Jackson just changed his entire persona, not because of her, but like his entire conception had changed for bad in 87. Whitney Houston came around in 87, and Alexander O'Neal, Taylor Dane. Everybody was getting influenced by all of the stuff that Janet Jackson was doing, and then what Chaka Khan had done a few years prior. So by the time we get to 89, people aren't even really talking about Thriller anymore. Like, that's old news. Talking about Miss You Much, first of all, sounds like pop and R&B music from the 1990s. But we're so far away now from Thriller, from I Feel For You. Like, that was only 5 years ago, 7 years ago from Miss You Much. Not even talking about going back to This Place Hotel. This Place Hotel and Miss You Much, different universes, different multiverses, which is funny too, because Janet was there when they were recording This Place Hotel, more than likely. So the fact that they're just in completely different universes from each other really shows you how, first of all, the Jackson family was in control of the 80s. But Miss You Much is just such a leap out forward for R&B and pop music and how the two worlds merge together that it's just a great way to end things for R&B. Because in my opinion, by 89, they had definitely succeeded in becoming the standard for pop music going forward. And we'll keep hearing that in season 2 of the show for sure. Next, let's talk about rap music. So rap started to essentially get recorded and become a genre in and of itself for artists in approximately 1980, maybe a little bit before then. And so there had been one track, one artist that came out with something interesting here and there. And that's been happening since like 1940, whatever. But with Curtis Blow in 1980, that was an official rap album that, as we talked about in the 1980 episode, was you were like a fly on the wall to a house party that was happening in New York City, and Curtis Blow was the MC doing his thing for the house party, and that was it. It seemed totally organic. It seemed totally off the cuff, which it probably wasn't because it was planned and recorded, but it comes across that way. So it really shows the beginning or the protozoan era of where rap started in this current 40 plus year span that we've found ourselves in with rap up until this moment. So to start off with, we're going to talk about Curtis Blow from 1980. The track is Rappin' Blow, Part 2. It's the first track on the album. And it's really just him doing his thing. It's him basically being an MC at a house party, and he's engaging back and forth with the audience in a seemingly organic way over breaks, which is to say that the DJ was isolating breaks in certain songs and just going back to them over and over and over again in order to create this continuous backtrack that he was rapping over as he was organically engaging with the audience. So this is basically just rap 101. He's giving it to us. And so this is a really great way to start things off. Next, we're going to skip 4 years. So we're skipping over The Message by Grandmaster Flash. We're skipping over Buffalo Gals in 83. And we're going right to 84 with Fat Boys, their album Fat Boys. And the track is Can You Feel It? So the reason that this is a milestone compared to The Message, because The Message to me was more in the vein of Curtis Blow in 1980. So not a lot had changed in the field of rap by this moment. I think I'd even said in the 1982 episode that it still comes across as fairly organic, off the cuff, in the moment, like Curtis Blow's album did. So to me, although the message in The Message is extraordinarily important for rap culture and black culture and all of us as a culture as a whole, talking about social injustice, it's not as much of a milestone as in 1984, Can You Feel It with Fat Boys. And the reason is that the turntablism had really updated itself considerably that year, because in this year too, Run DMC's first album came out. That was 84 also. So the reason that we called out Can You Feel It though is there's really great turntablism that's going using a lot of creative tracks and breaks from the DJ to create the backtrack here. Also, there's expert beatboxing that's happening in this. So it's just the beatboxing, it's the DJing, all of it put together in a really great package. We've moved considerably since 1980. It's already evolved significantly where the structure, the tracks on the album are more defined. It's less organic. It seems like there's more of a plan. And we're not in a house party. We're just in the studio. And like I said, the subject matter, they're talking about real actual things that are happening. And it's not just this call and response back and forth during a house party. There's actual subject matter. And there's little artifacts like beatboxing. So there's been a significant evolution in 4 years. And then a couple of years later, 1986, Beastie Boys Licensed to Ill, the new style. So 2 years after Can You Feel It came out, the Beastie Boys in this one track showed at once what was in the first half of the track and then whatever the future is in the second half of the track, which is why it's called the new style. I think I even talked about this in the 1986 episode, that they did this on purpose in order to show how the Beastie Boys are declaring that there's going to be a new way that we're going to approach rap, both in terms of our cadence and how the DJing is going to be executed, what the bass lines are going to sound like. Everything's going to be different from here on out. And so that's why it's really important to call out the new style in 86, because It was literally a pivotal moment in time in which we were shifting away from the golden age of rap, which with Run DMC, with Fat Boys, with the early LL Cool J, Houdini, and then evolving into this totally new thing. Now, there was a lot of great stuff that came out in 86 and 87 besides this, but this is sort of that pivotal moment to say, yep, okay, this a little bit started off like Fat Boys, and now we're going into this totally different thing. And that different new thing being 1988, NWA, Straight Outta Compton, the track. Not only have we evolved way beyond whatever Beastie Boys had envisioned for the new style, we're in this totally different place now. Like if you compare Straight Outta Compton, the track, to Rap and Blow Part 2 from 1980, so an 8-year span, these are completely different genres, completely different ideas, completely different approaches. The complexity of what Dr. Dre is spinning as the DJ, it's night and day. We're not just sitting there taking one break and turning it in a circle over and over and just repeating it and repeating it. Dre is throwing in all sorts of samples into just even this one track in order to be basically like a composer, putting all these different ideas, these little 2-second bites and breaks and pieces together to create this totally different song. And he's executing it flawlessly because he's Dre. And the cadence of what Ice Cube is ushering in, and then obviously bringing along with MC Ren and Eazy-E, that they're all bringing this totally different approach that sounds nothing like the rap cadence or the content of Fat Boys, Curtis Blow, even Beastie Boys sounds a little antiquated compared to NWA in this case, and that was only 2 years prior. And the fact is that Straight Outta Compton as an album was ushering in, at the very least, the next 3 to 4 years of popular rap music, and not just because pop rap needed to aggressively evolve out of where it had been middling over the last several years between, I would say, 84 and 88. There was a lot of pop rap that was coming out that wasn't hitting nearly as well, that we didn't even really hardly talk about during any of our episodes, and I'm not going to reference in detail here, but it's been happening and it will continue to happen over the next several years. But Straight Outta Compton was giving a clear indication of if you want to create consumable rap, you need to start going in this direction and a little bit less in the Curtis Blow direction, or even in the Run DMC direction. And so that also set the stage for what pop rap is going to do over the next several years. It creates a huge juxtaposition, a big broad line between it and alternative rap and underground rap. It just created all sorts of things all at the same time for the next 10, at the very least, years of rap culture, rap music, just from this one album and that track specifically, because that kind of starts everything. Okay, now let's talk about rock music, which as you listen to that, you go, oh, wow, rock music. That's a really broad genre. That's even broader than talking about pop music or talking about metal music. Yep, it's true. There's a lot of milestones that happen over the entire epic saga of 80s rock music, generally speaking, to a degree that we're going to sit here and cross all different kinds of rock subgenres in order to help tell this story, but they all do kind of thread together as one complementary genre broadly compared to pop music. It's definitely got its own permutations, and we're going to try and do what we can to honor that. But for the most part, we're just always talking about the same rock ideas, which is, we're playing heavy guitars. We got some rhythms going on for the most part. We've got subjects that aren't necessarily pop friendly, but they're not as hard as metal. So it's basically that middle ground between being metal and being pop, in terms of its acceptability and consumability. And at least in the 80s, there was a softness to it that definitely did not exist with heavy metal, which is why they're distinctly different. So, having said that, starting with 1980, Queen, The Game, Another One Bites the Dust. The reason that we're talking about this to start off with, even though in no way have I referenced Queen at all during the course of this season, is because it's a really great way to talk about where we were in the 70s and where we've arrived at in the 80s. Because in the prior decade, in the 70s, Queen were huge, and by the 80s, not so huge. And in 80, interestingly enough, they came out with Another One Bites the Dust as part of the album The Game. Another One Bites the Dust, being as popular as it was, is that it was signaling that the sounds of the 70s were starting to go away, and we were starting to think about what was coming along in the 80s, which sounded a little bit more Kiss-esque. There were some glam rock things that were going on. The bass lines were a little bit harder. The drum kits were a little bit heavier. And so Another One Bites the Dust is just a really great way for us to ground ourselves in the beginning of 80s rock, starting with 1980. But in the very next year, 1981, the Psychedelic Furs came out with Talk, 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 Pretty in Pink. So this has hard guitars It's much more rhythmic than Another One Bites the Dust. It sounds a little bit more 80s leaning and a little less 70s leaning, like Another One Bites the Dust was. Obviously, Paisley rock being what it is that Psychedelic Furs had helped usher in neo-psychedelic rock. All of this leans into those. It also sounds, as I said, I think in 79, that there was quite a lot of David Bowie influence. So the glam rock thing was still alive and well and still trying to find its footing in the 80s. So Pretty in Pink is a really great way to articulate what happened almost immediately after Another One Bites the Dust came out. And then Pretty in Pink came out and we immediately started launching off in the directions of where rock was going over the next several years. So then 2 more years later, U2 came out with War and Sunday Bloody Sunday. So the interesting thing about connecting Pretty in Pink to Sunday Bloody Sunday, first of all, you have to take the context into account here, right? Because U2 was coming from a place of reacting to the Troubles, and so there was a lot more counterculture. I mean, War is the name of the album. There was a lot more turmoil that was going on with them, with their people, with their culture, in their hearts when they were making this music. I mean, Sunday Bloody Sunday is in direct relation to the event of Bloody Sunday as part of the Troubles. So they're reacting to that. So there's a lot more emphasis and social commentary behind it. But as far as the instrumentation's concerned, the guitars are getting increasingly janglier. They're getting more melodic than Pretty in Pink was. The atmosphere of the music is definitely changing too, where the sounds are just getting bigger. The singing is getting more intense than it was. Even with Another One Bites the Dust. Like Another One Bites the Dust and Sunday Bloody Sunday also had these little tiny artifacts that relate to each other, but then Pretty in Pink is a driving, moving along song, like it's a driving beat. And Sunday Bloody Sunday also has a really driving beat to it, but it's softened considerably from Another One Bites the Dust, which is really interesting. Because Sunday Bloody Sunday is about a hard subject matter, and yet it is a really melodic song. The singing in it, it's got a wide range to it, kind of unlike Another One Bites the Dust, which is interesting. It actually has the range that Another One Bites the Dust does. Pretty in Pink doesn't necessarily as much, but they all have this common thread of the music softening up a little bit. It's like evening out while becoming more melodic at the same time, which is really interesting because give it another minute and get to 1985 and we get to Gene Loves Jezebel, Immigrant, Always Aflame, which seems to swing back talking about the other iteration of rock that we were talking about a minute ago with Pretty in Pink, where it's taking that neo-psychedelic rock aspect and it's carrying that forward, but it's also kind of sounds like Sunday Bloody Sunday by U2. There's these little things that, despite the fact that there's 1,000 different angles of rock going on at the same time, they all have these interesting connection points with each other where there's more experimentation around guitar work. The music seems to keep getting attached to pop elements at the time, you know, like Another One Bites the Dust had more like rootsy things connected to it. Pretty in Pink was more new wave and punk, and Sunday Bloody Sunday was even verging into alternative territory, and Always Aflame has more of that psychedelic rock that we know about from the 90s. So they continue to add all these little bits and pieces to them, but they still have these common threads and connection points, and you can hear the commonality between Sunday Bloody Sunday and Always Aflame, where Always Aflame is more contemplative and Sunday Bloody Sunday is more out there and extroverted, but they still have similar melodic guitars going on with them at the same time. It's very interesting stuff. And then the very next year, Sonic Youth came out with Evol and Tom Violence, which seems like everything has taken a hard right turn again, where all of that melodic music has shifted away and now we're getting into really aggressive guitar work that was happening with Sunday Bloody Sunday again, where there was really driving electric guitars and the basses sound like they're really heavy and kind of in your face. And the singing has really evolved considerably over this period of time, where I think Gene Loves Jezebel, the music was a little bit harder to detect than U2 was, and Sonic Youth is going even further in that direction of being harder to understand, harder to grasp, and the voice itself is just becoming kind of another instrument in the great wall of sound that's being executed that started with things like Sunday Bloody Sunday, and maybe we're getting played with a teeny tiny little bit in Pretty in Pink. And then another year later, like we're talking about a milestone after milestone after milestone, like 1-2 years at a time. Like there were so many changes and shifts that happened this wild. So in 87, Dinosaur Jr., You're Loving All Over Me, Sludge Feast. This is taking what was happening in Tom Violence and going even further into that just wall of sound, slowing things down until they're just nice and grimy. And the subject matter is getting darker, deeper, kind of like how all of this stuff is happening over the course of the last 7 years. Go back to Another One Bites the Dust and listen to Sludge Feast. They sound almost nothing alike. right? They're all still rock music, but the rock genre has just been aggressively changing so much over the last even few years that these rock artists, probably even more so than avant-garde artists in the decade, were really aggressively challenging themselves to experiment with new ideas and different approaches, even if it's all still kind of staying in the same rock lane as it always has been. So the story of rock this decade is very much like what punk was doing, that it just aggressively evolved. The only difference is that rock never fell asleep for several years. It just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. Because the very next year, with 1988, Pixies, Surfer Rosa, Where's My Mind? So it's again challenging you to think about what rock music is and what it can be, because Where's My Mind and Sludge Feast do have common factors, right? There's still that wall of sound that's happening where you're just kind of getting hit with all sorts of instruments all at once. But there's dynamics to Where's My Mind that Sludge Feast doesn't have in as great a supply. It sounds a little bit more like Sunday Bloody Sunday or Always Aflame to a certain extent. You know, it's a little bit more dynamic than what had been happening a minute ago. And as a result, rock just continues to be changing. It's just so in flux and it's so aggressively changing that it's hard to really keep a handle on, oh, it's going over here, now it's going over there, now it's going up here and down there and all around. Where's it going to end up? Well, the answer is, in 1989, Nirvana came out with their first album, Bleach, About a Girl, which is their first hit. And you can very much hear in About a Girl how they got to this moment through all of these milestone tracks that we've talked about. You can hear Another One Bites the Dust a little bit. You can hear a little bit of Pretty in Pink. You can hear a little bit of Sunday Bloody Sunday, Always Aflame, Tom Violence, Sludge Feast, Where's My Mind? All of these different ideas, which is the greatness of Nirvana and Kurt Cobain and Dave Grohl and everybody else, that they were pulling together basically everything that was happening in the 80s. And we're not even talking about Landshark, right, from Fang. Like all of this stuff leading to this moment that was Nirvana. That's in many respects why they were so successful, because they pulled together about 15 years worth of rock and punk and metal evolution into one concept, which starts with Bleach, About a Girl. It was them bringing all these seemingly disparate ideas together, right? Because as I've been listing these off, and you're going to go in and listen to the essential tracks that I listed off here and go, how do these all relate to each other? And let me tell you, Nirvana figured out how they all relate to each other and put it into one package, because that's exactly what happened. And so that's why this is a great way to end the 80s for rock music, because we're about to get into Nirvana style grunge, and then everything is going to change, because from the 1989 and 88 episodes, we are going to clear the table of everything that's been on it and put these new major ideas on the table, like Nirvana style grunge. And so because of that, it's just a great way to end things, because it's pulling all that stuff in and then just discarding whatever didn't work. So that was it. What did you agree with some of the stuff we highlighted here for some of these genres? What did you disagree with? What did I miss? I know that I missed a ton. So I'm sure I missed a ton. What did you learn? Did you maybe learn about some of these connectable threads between some of these milestone moments in some of these genres? Hopefully, I mean, that was the point of wrapping up the decade. But one thing I want to call out before we close up here is just, again, talking about how far we've already come with the 1980s. Right? Every time I would talk about listen to the first track in the milestones and then listen to the last one and just think about how far we've come in the evolution of music already. I mean, it's astounding to me how creative the 80s were in just pulling all of these different things together, ripping apart conventions, putting together new ones, inventing new stuff out of thin air. There's all sorts of really amazing things that happened in the 1980s. And I'm so excited for where we're going in the 1990s too, because if you think that the 80s was like the moment for creativity, the 90s is like 100 times that. Where we start in 1990 and where we end in 1999 is going to be unbelievable. You are not going to believe how far we go. So the 1980s, I think, was just sort of the warm up to all the aggressive shifting and moving and pivoting that we're going to experience in the 1990s. So I am really excited to get going with season 2, and I hope all of you will join me on that journey. So in the meantime, make sure that you check out the essential playlist for today's episode. So all the tracks that I talked about today is in the essential playlist for this year. Make sure to check out my big playlist, 142 tracks of what I consider to be the most important, impactful, best of the best without going way too overboard from the 1980s. I guarantee you that I started off with 1,500 songs that I was deciding against, and I somehow managed to get down to 142. So amazing in and of itself, because you know what? Nobody's going to listen to a 1,500 song playlist, believe me. So because of that, this is the essential bits. But did I leave some stuff out? Totally. There's a lot of really sad things that I left by the wayside, but we press forward. Please join us again for season 2. We're going to start with season 2 before you know it. So make sure that you join us again if you're interested in going on the 90s journey with us. Make sure to rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us. Find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Make sure you subscribe, because maybe we'll be coming out with surprise episodes between now and when season 2 starts. And you probably want to know when season 2 is going to kick off. So make sure you subscribe so you don't have to go looking for us. Or remember, make sure to tell everybody. Tell everybody. Tell people you know, people you don't know, people you don't want to talk to, people you're dying to talk to. Tell everybody. Because at the end of the day, we're all enjoying this music together. We all want to share it with each other. We all want to talk passionately about all of this music and our perspectives and our opinions and what we love and what we hate and what's meaningful for us and why this thing changed my life and that thing. And the only way that you can find all this stuff out is if you engage with it fearlessly and genuinely and with yourself entirely open to whatever it is that's coming at you, because it's not scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening, everybody.